On this episode of the Construction Dorks, we sit down with Devon Madden, a co owner at Madden Sheet Metal, to talk about the future of education in the HVAC industry and the larger construction industry in general. Devon has her PhD in English and is an experienced teacher who firmly believes that education can't stop at the classroom door. It was an amazingly fun and curious conversation, so definitely grab a drink, sit back, and enjoy. And we're live and back here with the Dorks for episode 91. We're going to talk about the future of education in HVAC, and we're going to talk with Devon Madden. And we got Trent Lennenbach here, and Travis Voss will be joining us shortly. He was doing his fatherly duties and picking up his daughter. But for starters, I actually have an interesting drink today. So I have a twist on a Negroni. So a Negroni is Campari and sweet vermouth and typically like gin, right? And this is one that has bourbon and it uses a Tika a Tika sweet vermouth. So it's just a little bit different. And I think they called it a really sweet French word that I will mispronounce. So, but it was close enough to Boulevard that I just call it a Boulevarder. So I think that works. How about you, Trent? Are you drinking anything today?
No, I think hopefully when for the first time ever, I think we're gonna have a a drive-by when Travis comes in. So hopefully he'll have something more exciting. But I've just sitting here working away on the computer, drinking a Topo Chico this evening. So a nice carbonated mineral water for me. But Devin, I definitely saw something a little more interesting that you
Yes,
lifted up earlier.
I
So
have an Old Forester. This is a 100 proof rye. So I'm going very old fashioned. This is just whiskey in a glass. So here we go.
And
Yeah.
so it's just for the audience, I'm sure there's plenty more about you that's more interesting than that glass of bourbon. So go ahead and introduce yourself and
Well, cheers. Thank you guys so much for having me on. I've been really looking forward to this. So I'm Devon Madden. I am the owner of Madden Sheet Metal. We're a fabrication shop. We mostly work in the HVAC space. We make lots of things like curb adapters and roof curbs and that kind of stuff. We also do lots of welded exhaust work. We're right outside of Chicago. So we're a union shop. Which is a big part of sort of the core identity of the company. I've been with the company. The company started at just the most perfect time to open a small business. We opened in January of 2020. So
Oh,
yeah, everything was
just
great for like 2 or 3 months, and then the entire world fell apart, and then things were crazy, and we're still getting ourselves back from that. But it's been a really, really interesting journey. But I have sort of an untraditional background in the HVAC and mechanical world, being that I was a teacher. I'm an educator. That was my entire career. I have a PhD in English literature. I taught at the college level, taught high school students. I've taught students from sort of a really broad spectrum of different types of institutions and abilities and approaches to teaching. And then for the past 2 years, I've been working at Madden Sheet Metal, and that transition has been absolutely fascinating and really interesting. And right now, as I'm working and doing all the other things, my passion project is I am writing a book that's about the future of the HVAC industry and how education plays a role in that. What choices do we need to be making right now to educate everybody in the industry all across different spectrums, so that we can prepare for that future? But also, I'm interested in sort of, I think that there's so many different disciplines that are so fascinating, but I think that they can get really siloed. So there's all this fascinating work being done in education and in sort of academic fields about how to make things more approachable and how to teach the individual and how to think about the individual human minds and make sure that we're really giving people content in ways that they can really process it and do something fascinating with it. And then understanding the enormous diversity of how people learn and where their skills are. So there's all of that work being done in sort of the academic field, but it can be feel so far away from the work that people actually do. And I think that the trades, right, the industrial trades have a lot to learn from academia, but I actually think even more so, academia has a ton to learn from the way that people in the trades are educated. And then I think that putting these different approaches to learning into conversation will be really, really interesting.
So, Devin, as you started to kind of look at HVAC and how they're learning, what were some of the things that immediately you noticed about the difference between that and the more traditional students that you've had throughout your career?
Yeah. So it's so interesting because when I first met my husband, who's a third generation sheet metal worker, he was just starting his apprenticeship and I was just starting my PhD program. So we were joking that like he was getting his PhD in sheet metal while I was getting my PhD in Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Um, and people would call us like the poet and the tinner, like we had these very different worlds. Um, but what I find fascinating about the like entire world, and this is not just HVAC, this is just I think construction world in general, is that the people that you have the most enormous diversity of human minds in this industry, and we need that, right? You need people who think in totally different ways, and it's so funny because my entire extended family, John's whole family is in construction, and they're wildly different people with wildly different skill sets and wildly different abilities. And we all do totally different things. But you need people who are able to think in these totally different ways in order to make this industry really work. And I think that one of the things that's been so interesting for me is that I came in from this world of ideas, right? My dad was a marketing person, right, who basically sold stories for a living. I was a academic, for my whole life and was a researcher and a professor and had these very sort of siloed jobs in my little English department. And I was a curriculum designer and was doing this kind of work. And I think that I was thinking about education in very traditional academic sense. Travis is here. Hey, Travis, how you
Hey,
doing?
everybody. Rolling in late.
All right, in five.
No,
Don't worry,
And
post
we're
production will
live.
fix this, right? We'll get it
Yeah.
fixed.
Right. We'll
absolutely.
fix it in post.
Eh, but keep going, Devin. You were kind
Oh
of
yeah.
talking about that.
And the work that John was doing was entirely hands-on, right? He was, literally working with tools all, during his apprenticeship, learning every single aspect of the shop that he was in. And then he was in school learning other things that weren't necessarily going to be part of the actual aspect of the job that he did. But even though he was in a fabrication shop, he learned testing and balance, he learned installation, he learned all these different technical skills. He also learned a bunch of computer programming. He learned some mechanical engineering and all this really broad world that he was learning while he was in the school aspect. But then most of the work he was doing was during his apprenticeship. I was there going into student debt, paying for my master's degree and then my PhD. Although my PhD I got for free because I got a teaching job. So I was teaching and sort of an
Right on.
indentured servant during those times.
Yeah.
And he was actually making money while he was in his apprenticeship. And it was fascinating sort of seeing the way that we were both, learning at the same time and how different our experiences were and how hands-on and tangible and real the work was that he was doing, whereas mine was in this very conceptual space. So it was so interesting seeing sort of how our education journeys were kind of, moving. We were in this sort of the same direction of just beginning that whole aspect of our lives together, and how different our educations were. But I graduated from my PhD program and got my doctorate. He finished his, apprenticeship and became a journeyman. And it's not like you have to stop learning. I mean, if
Right.
you
Yeah.
want anything to work, and I think that so often we're so focused on the degree or the certification or whatever the next step is that we're not paying enough attention, not in any one industry, but in our like society in general, in the fact that real education never ends, right? You have
Yeah.
to have somebody who's got
Right.
that learning mindset forever. Can you imagine if, like, the most recent time that you got whatever it was we were trying to achieve, the degree or the certification or, whatever the next step was, and you're like, okay, I know everything there is to know now. Now I'm done.
Yeah.
Like, you'd be outdated in like 3 minutes, right? If we're not constantly, educating ourselves this next point, we're not going to learn anything. And then, of course, we started a small business together, and like, oh my God. I mean, the amount that we had to learn how to do, and we just had to figure it out. And but there were all of these resources available to us that we never would have thought about. So we did some traditional stuff together. When we were starting our small business, we actually went through and took sort of a business development program at our local community college, which was great and very affordable and really useful. But then we also found out that there were small business centers that have tons of resources
Mhm.
that are entirely free and are really well funded, and you can get individual individual mentors to kind of bring you through what kind of programming is available and what might be most useful. And then we joined SmackNow, which is where we met Travis. And they have so much educational programming that is
Yeah.
if you're a member, entirely free to those members. That is incredibly useful. And if there's something specific that we need more programming on, all we have to do is ask the education director and she'll set it up. And it's incredible how many resources are there, but I'm not sure if everybody always knows how many of these resources are available to them. And also, I think that we need to establish sort of that learner's mindset where people are really genuinely investing because it's time
Mhm.
consuming and it can be expensive, right? Even in your own time and resources to take that time away from other work to sit down and say, no, I have to entirely learn this new thing. But the argument that I'm making is that it's entirely worth it and necessary, and that what we where the intersection is between the work that I've done as an educator and then the work I'm doing now in the construction field is nurturing that learner's mindset, nurturing that notion that we're all always learning, that, I'm not an imposter just because I don't know as much as other people do in this industry. I'm learning, but aren't we all? So, yeah, that's the
I'm
passion
I'm always
project that
blown
I'm on right
away.
now. Yeah.
I'm always blown away at the kind of like the youth, or when you talk to people who are in school, or they're working through their studies. They're like, man, I just can't. I can't wait till I'm done with this. I can't wait till I never have to study again. I'm just like,
Right.
ooh, like,
It's not how it works.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's how life works, but
No,
Well,
it's
and
not
I
how
um,
don't think
anything
I
works,
don't
right?
think our education system really has kind of involved with with the way the modern workplace, right? I mean, the cynic in me is like, okay, they put it together in the 1800s because they need to kick out factory workers. They need
Right.
to train people to sit in
Occasionally.
place, do manual tasks, to do what you're told, and and then
Yes.
maybe at that point in time, all you really needed to do is learn what you needed, and you just keep punching the clock. But we definitely have evolved into the people that excel in most industries are the ones that are a lot of the self-taught people, the people that are driven
Yes.
to continue to learn.
Well, think about literally anyone that you know who is really, really great at what they do. They're just dorks about it, right? They just are
Right.
constantly learning more about that. They're never going to be the one who's like, oh, I know it all already. Never.
Right.
Right? They're
yeah,
always going to
because
be like, oh, this is what I'm reading right now, or I just heard this thing yesterday, or this is the
Yeah.
podcast I'm listening to, right? They're always into it. And it was like that with my students. I taught at the Illinois Math and Science Academy, which was a high school for gifted students. So these were the kids, basically, they would get enrolled in the school if they would max out on either the math or science classes that they were taking at their home school because they had already taken such advanced courses. So we
Hmm.
got kids from all over the state. It was a boarding school. They all lived in this little, little bubble of sweet nerdy geniuses. But I taught English there. And these kids, lots of them were just very naturally brilliant, like high IQ, really high performing students. But the ones who actually are going off and doing incredible things, it's not what they learned in their classrooms, whatever. It was because they were constantly just on their own, watching YouTube videos and trying out problems and coming up with really cool questions and stopping by their teacher's office hours and bugging them with new information. And it's that like learner's mindset, that stuff that we were like, it has to be inherent. It has to be coming from your own self motivation of really
Yes.
wanting to know what comes next. But it certainly doesn't stop with school. I'm sorry, I'm like rambling on
No.
about this.
No. Have
But
at it.
I,
No, this is
Travis,
good to rant
totally
about.
agree with you that our school systems are really set up in this entire, if there's any part of our culture and our society that is just so radically due for an overhaul, it's our, I think, traditional education system. But in so many ways, I feel like the types of education that I sometimes see in the construction industry, we have a lot to learn from that. Like the way that
Mhm.
apprenticeships are set up, not all of them, but really, really good ones, like an excellently run, really well funded, really well established apprenticeship program. The methodologies, the theory behind it, the way in which the actual learning happens, if we were to bring that into high school classes, I feel like it would just be so much more engaging and powerful and feel so real and, directly impacting their lives. And so that's what I'm kind of interested in, is like what's already working in the education system that we have right now that's happening in
Mhm.
construction, and then what's not. How do we like maybe use some of the other, pedagogical studies, the approaches that traditional teachers might take that actually could be useful as we're trying to think about how do we start educating people for the future that we know we're going to need, because we know that the skill sets that people have right now are not the skill sets people are going to need 10 years from now.
Right.
The careers, what it's going to look like to be in the construction industry in 10 years, we already know that a lot of those jobs hardly even exist yet, right? But we need people who are going to have that learner's mindset. So instead of being scared of it, they're psyched for it and they're nerdily, studying this stuff on their own and getting all passionate and being people like Trent who are like, oh, I see some kind of need that's unmet here. I'm going to jump in and learn my on the fly, kind of build the airplane while it's flying and make it happen.
I think most institutional learning paths today, though, or at least, well, I maybe can't speak for exactly today, but in my past,
Yeah.
don't do a good job of what you've said, Devin. I don't think any of them really train much out into the future. I mean, most of what I've even seen, and this comes from military, apprenticeship, and higher ed. But I
Yeah.
think a lot of it is training for yesterday's battle, training for
Mhm.
yesterday's job.
Right.
It always bothered me. Like, Travis, I know you were in the army too, but it was like training in the army, post 9/11, and we're in here like, all right, we're gonna train how to use a bayonet. I'm like, wait,
Yes,
what?
sir.
Like,
Yeah.
all
And
right,
then you
well,
ask your drill sergeant, like, how often am I really going to use this? And he said, my drill sergeant told me right to my face, is like, if you ever hear fixed bayonets in charge, we're done.
yeah,
This is
it's
it.
already over.
It's already over.
Right.
And then in the apprenticeship too, it was even through the big adoption of computer, CAD and all the
Right.
things that were coming out, we were still pulling T squares and drafting tables out and
Right.
30-degree, 60-degree triangles and and I mean, part of me understands that there is like a basic level of knowledge to like craft things like that, and like the vision and things, but it's not training for the future of the workforce, right? So
So,
I've seen it in every. So
yeah.
I don't think anyone's really perfected it yet.
Well, how can you perfect it? We don't even know what it is, right? You can't master a skill that doesn't even exist yet. But I think that what we need to do is we need to, like, and I keep on telling this to my kids too, right? Jonathan, I bet you do as well, like having the homeschooled kids also. It's like not just about the skill that you're learning, it's about learning how to learn.
Learn. Yeah.
It's like, it, honest, I was an English teacher. It didn't matter what book we read. There are gazillions of books. Here I am. We're just constantly adding more to the enormous, unreadably huge pile of knowledge that's out there. It doesn't matter. It's learning how to ask questions about the text you're reading, how to read something closely, how to think about things critically, how to,
Yeah.
have
Mhm.
basic content knowledge and how to read something and take things out of it. I don't care what you're reading. I care about the foundational skills that you're building as a result of that work that you're doing in my class. But I had to be really clear, here's what it is that I'm trying to get you to be able to do, right? I'm trying to get you to learn how to read generously and learn how to read critically. What does that actually mean? What does that look like with any
Yeah.
text? And then how do you take that to the next step? So if we can think about that in all of the kind of the trade school programs, in the apprenticeships, in the continuing education, like this is why I'm asking you to learn this skill, and being really clear about what the purpose is, what is the thing I'm actually intending you to learn how to do. And unless you can justify it, then I think we need to rethink it altogether.
Yeah. And I have a question for you. So, you were working with gifted children, which
Yeah.
are sort of a they're I've noticed that these are the
What's
people
that
that are
like?
more primed to self-learn.
Yeah.
They're the people that self-learn kind of automatically. As you move to start to
Yes.
deal with more tradespeople, do you see a difference, or would you characterize? I know you said that everybody's vastly different, but I do think there are stereotypes that
Yes.
draw us into a specific vocation, and
Yes.
HVAC's got a lot of. I find all of construction fascinating, but like what did you see, like, looking at those two groups, the group that's there for a general education but is gifted, and then
Right.
that group that's sort of very hands-on, very much about solving a physical problem or building something physically? Did you see big differences in the groups, or do you think they're similar?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that I think that it's really hard to classify, what a gifted student looks like because they look like totally different things. I had kids who were really far on the autism spectrum, right? Who could, who could solve these insane math problems like in their head. But if you tried to get them to have like a conversation about like, oh, what drink are you having? That would be like a legitimate
Mhm.
challenge for them. Then I had other kids who were like the most social, affable, incredible humans you would ever meet, right? But I think the same is true in the construction industry. But I think that there tends to be this stereotype that there's like a certain type of guy, and it's always a guy, right? Like there's a certain type of guy who is working in the industry. And I feel like my father in law is like the total, like if you like close your eyes and imagine a sheet metal worker, that's who my father in law is. He's like built like a gorilla, and he's like always, he's got like, his overalls and his belt on at all times, and he can like climb things and knock everything together. He knows how to do everything. He can do like, he can tile your floor and do your entire electrical system and like, rework your entire HVAC system. He's one of those guys, super, with his hands, never reads anything. Is just like up there and does it, learns by doing. We'll mess it up, we'll fix it and then redo it before he'd like, actually read a manual. And he's always got the chew in his mouth. He's perfect. He's like the only person in the world who like never doubts himself. Every single one of his stories is like, and then they all told me I was right. That's how the stories end. It's great. But that's not everybody in the industry. I mean, the world would actually probably work really, really well if there were a lot more of my father-in-law because he's actually pretty good at his job. But that's not everybody in the industry. You see people who look like me in the industry all the time, right? There are a lot of people, and you need people whose brains work the way that mine do, which was kind of surprising to me. I was like, really? I can be useful at all in this space? But it's true. And then you see people who have other skills. I don't think that there's one thing that a construction worker looks like. I think that that's actually what we need to work on is getting construction people in the construction field whose brains work in all kinds of ways because we're going to need that, right? We're going to need people who have so many different types of skill sets, especially as we're going into a field that's going to increasingly become more technical, more future driven, more driven by really rapidly changing technologies. So it's kind of interesting. But to say, I don't think that there's one classification. I do think that people who are really successful, either, whether it was like my students who are going off and doing incredible things, and going to Harvard and Yale and Stanford, whether it was those kids or people in the construction industry, I think it's curiosity. I think that like, are you curious? Are you self motivated? Do you actually have something in you that's like, oh, this is cool. I want to learn more. So I think that it's pretty similar, regardless of what field you're in. Sort of what like mentality and way of approaching problems ends up actually leading to overall success.
Have you found anything that really encourages that curiosity? Because you are writing a book about this, which means you're really
Yeah.
thinking about like how do we change the mindset of the people that aren't as curious to be. And I think everybody's curious at some level. So I think there's something there. There's a seed.
Yes.
But what are maybe some of the ways you've thought about encouraging that curiosity, especially amongst tradespeople who, we're deadline driven. Um,
Yes.
so it's kind of like, I mean, I kind of would say it's kind of trying to learn basketball while playing professional basketball at the same time. Like you don't
Right.
get training, you just have to play the entire time and try to play better as you're going. Um,
Right.
once you're actually out of your apprenticeship and into that stage that you talked about, which is the learning curiosity stage. Like you're done
Right.
with the basics, so you can understand stuff, and now
Right.
you're going to go learn how to build and teach everybody else how to build. So,
Right.
so like what are those things that can nurture that curiosity, and how do because I honestly do have a lot of people that I have to deal with in my life that i I lose my mind at how uncurious they are and
Right.
how quickly they put down stuff when they're done, and it's like, well, that's kind
Right.
of a C, and they're like, well, it's a C but it's done, and it's like, but
Yeah.
your name's on it and it's a
Yeah.
C.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's like try to get a bunch of 17-year-olds to read Hamlet at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. Like, oh my
Yes. Yeah.
god, just to the blank stares. No, I think it's so. This is probably a radically oversimplified answer. There's no answer to this, right? We all have
Yeah. Yeah.
different
Right on.
approaches. I think it's giving people agency, giving
Mhm.
people like control and real, like seeing that what
Autonomy.
they're doing actually has an impact on the next step. I think that way too often people, especially at bigger companies, right? People entirely ignore the guys who are actually doing the work. And then if the guys are like, "Oh, maybe we can try this different way," or "This thing isn't working," or "We don't understand this yet, and here's how we're doing it," or they're just not using the new system, and then you're like, "You're not using the system. We just trained you on the new thing. You have to do the new thing now." They don't have agency over it. They don't feel like they own it. I think that if people feel like this is my choice, I own it. I like this is a decision that I made, not a decision that was made for me. I think that we get so much more buy-in.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that if we often look at those people and we think of that they are not innovative,
Right.
they don't have the curiosity that. But if you go to those same people, if you're whether it's on the job site or in a fabrication shop, and you look around their work area, look at all the things that they've tinkered together. Look at all the
Right.
things that they've made to make their jobs easier. Like you're saying earlier, it's like they have the same mindset. They just apply it with they just have a different way of applying it. And
Right.
I do think that kind of back to some of the stuff you're talking about with changing the way that we are educating people. It's like if we could spend more time, and to Trent's point, like okay, we start with the basics. You get a week on the basics.
Right.
This is where we all start. This is how we do a stretch out. This is how we lay out
Right.
the square round
We're
elbow.
gonna
Blah
lay
blah
it out
blah
with the
blah.
T square. Right. Yeah.
Right, yeah, right. Okay, you got that. Now here's what we do now, and then really just be more like okay, present them the information and really teach them to think critically about it. I think that you are going to start seeing back to that agency, you'll start seeing people kind of self-select into the different roles where we could really get probably more value out of them than trying to just shove them down the oh you're a shop worker, you're an accountant, whatever that role that we're trying to push them towards.
And I mean, and that's the problem. Right? If we get even in an industry like HVAC, right? Which it's so funny. It's like this enormous, how many billions of dollars? It's something crazy. It's a huge industry. Gets no attention, by the way, right? We're all talking about like the tech industry. Nobody's employed there. Like
Right.
this is where the actual jobs are. It's a huge industry. Um, but it's not, but even within that industry, it's like things get so siloed,
Mhm.
right? So like you have like the guys who are working in the fab. Do you know a single fab shop ever in the world that doesn't have some kind of conflict between the shop and the office?
No, everything runs great.
And
Yeah.
No,
Pretty
that's
clean.
perfect. We all of the shops that we've ever gone into
yes,
just are
never
just
any
like we
communication
need to
issues.
bother your or
Exactly.
borrow your
Well,
father-in-law to come in and tell us that he's figured this out.
Right.
right. And it's the same thing, right? Like in, any kind of installation places, the guys who are actually doing the installation and the salespeople who are selling the work, always, never. So funny. And it's so funny. It's like that, but it's like that everywhere, right? Like when I was teaching, the faculty and the administration were constantly doing, never would we just talk and synchronize and collaborate and work together to solve the problem. Never was it like, hey, here's the problem. The problem is the enemy. It's us against the problem. Like instead of
Right.
doing that, it's always the like, well, you did and the blah, blah, blah. But if we can get over ourselves and recognize that we have to stop this nonsense of like, some people having more power and control and agency over actual decision making. And if we can get past that nonsense and give everybody the sense where they're like, hey, look, if I say something, it's actually going to make a difference. Like it's going to actually change the process that we're doing and give people that power. I just think it's so much easier to get buy-in. And that way, when we have like, instead of being like, hey, here's a solution that has nothing to do, like you didn't bring up that problem. It can be like, oh, I'm actually listening to the problems you're having or listening to the suggestions that you have. And then we're integrating these together and then coming up with a solution, and it's us against the problem instead of us against each other.
It's
Yeah.
way easier to give agency to people that are curious, though. I'd say,
Yeah.
like
Yes,
So
that's fair.
that's the question is like, how do we nurture that creativity? How do we nurture that curiosity and that learner's mindset? How do we make people not scared of the next thing that's coming, but excited by it? And but if you think about the history of this, the reasons that people I think get so freaked out by new technologies or concerned that things are going to foundationally and really, I mean, at a very core level, change the very nature of the work that they've done for years and are really, really good at, is because we're not good at making those transitions. You hear all these stories and all these things of these people who were the smartest, best respected guys in the shop, and some new technology comes around, and then all of a sudden they don't feel like they have any kind of
Hmm.
like role anymore. My husband John talks about this all the time. The guy who did the layout and the design, right? That was the smartest guy in the shop. And then all of a sudden, these CAD programs came around, like, right when he was kind
Right.
of beginning in the industry, and it completely displaced a lot of these old timers who were really amazing at the craft that they had. But what if we could go back and like do it differently with the way that that transition went? There are so many skills that that guy had, and if he had owned it, if we had been like, hey, look how much faster this goes with this new program. Let's give you every possible resource that you need so that you're the person who really owns this project and you're going to have real control over how this rollout happens. And we're bringing your voice in throughout this entire process to make sure that the knowledge that you have and the skills that you've spent all of these, years and years developing are actually going to be part of this new system. Help us make this transition happen, and you're going to lead it, you're going to own it, this project is yours. But instead, we tend to sometimes have these like, solutions coming in that are entirely top down, and it never
Hmm.
works, right? It doesn't work. It's in the school systems, it doesn't work in small businesses like mine, it doesn't work in, larger structures either.
It's kind of interesting that we keep going back to this agency thing. One of the sessions that Jeff Sample and I did at the SmackDown convention was, we called it "Kill the Company," and we kind of took the mindset of, we did a SWOT analysis, and then we took everybody through the SWOT analysis, and then we turned it around and we said, okay, you've just left your company you're at now. You're starting a new company to put that other company out of business. What would you do? And
Right.
if you do this with software companies or whatever else, they'll try to think of other product ideas that will
Right.
dwarf the but almost everybody in that room circled back around culture, circled back around empowering their employees, giving
Yeah.
them more agency, giving them more control over and I found that really interesting. There wasn't a lot of, oh, we would go to this new market, we would take on this new customer, we would start service if they did. There was not a lot of these new product lines or new offerings that they were going to do that was going to be so big that they're going to put the company out. They were actually just going to do the same type of work. They were just going to have that more engaged and involved employee base, which I found really interesting. So,
Yeah.
so back to the education thing. How do we educate people up through junior high, high school, the trades, college, to have people that are ready to step into those kind of companies?
I think that there's so much, and I don't have the answer yet, so I'm still researching
I
and
was
trying
waiting for
to
that. I thought
figure it
I was
all
going
out.
to end
And
the
I know I'm
recording
not
right
going to
now.
come up with one answer, right, to any of it. Um, I think that the education that my husband got, where he got to leave high school, and he did a lot of other things for a whole bunch of years where he was all over the place, and but by the time that he got back to it in his like mid 20s, right, and he started his apprenticeship, he understood the end goal right away. He knew how much money he'd be making. He knew what kind of work that would look like. He knew exactly how long the apprenticeship was going to be. He had a very, very specific end goal in mind. And yet, throughout the entire process, that what that could possibly look like kept on growing and expanding, right? The idea of like what that world could look like getting bigger and bigger. So I think this is true regardless of what kind of field anybody goes into. I think that we need to have that idea of like, I know exactly what I'm aiming for, but what you're aiming for gets more and more exciting and broader and broader. And the options of like what direction you could go in continue to expand the more you learn. And I think that, um, you know, that there are some really just basic things that the construction industry informally does really well, but doesn't like formalize. But I think
Hmm.
primarily it's mentorships. I think that the way that my husband John got really, really good as just like basically running a fab shop. So he was both before we started our own company, he was the superintendent of like the largest fabrication shop in the Chicago area. So he, rose to that really quickly in his career, which was kind of why we had to start our own company. He's like, I'm 30 and I can't get a promotion. I can't do this for another 35 years. I need to do something else. But the way he got there is that he had a bunch of old timers who he just hung around with for 6 or 7 years, who taught him every single skill that they had. And they did it because they gave a shit. And they did it because they had to. Right? It was kind of part of their job. In order for it to be physically easier on them, they take this 23-year-old kid and they have him doing stuff. But they didn't just have him, on the liner table all day, every day for 7 years, but they were really genuinely invested. And here's all this knowledge that I have. I'm giving this to you. And it's a mentorship. And I think that they learned a lot from him too. We talked about this, Travis, a little bit in your technology session, right? How
Yeah.
these mentorships work, where if you pair people who are sometimes, of older generations with younger ones, it really is a symbiotic relationship because
Yes.
younger people tend to be way more tech savvy and the older people tend to have just these decades of really hard skills. But I think these mentorships are really how a lot of people in the construction industry that I've talked to, if they're being really honest, that's really where they've learned a lot from. But can you imagine if you were paired with mentors who were in vastly different careers and you got to switch and had several maybe, but rather than just having
Mhm.
traditional teachers, what would it be like if, you know um, I got to work with some 15-year-old who was really excited about learning how to research for an academic book, right? Mentoring, like, here's how it really
Yeah.
goes. Let me show you in real time what this looks like. And I think so many people would want to take on that role because you get better at your job if you're teaching it to somebody else. And
Right.
I think that the one of the ways that you can know you know something is if you can clearly communicate it to somebody who doesn't have the amount of experience that you do. And I think a lot of people would want to jump into those opportunities. But I think because we treat the world of traditional education as if it's its own strange little system and its own kind of, little black box that's all off by itself. It's like, here is school and it will go here, right? As if it's like separate from the rest of life. It just seems so foolish to me. And then also the idea that like now you get your degree and that means something. Degrees
Yeah.
don't mean anything, your certifications sometimes might. Like I want to make sure that, the people who are welding the the duct that's going to be hanging 5,000 feet above somebody's head is actually done correctly. So
Right.
stuff's not
Right.
falling on anyone. You want certain levels of standards. I want to make sure that like my medical doctor, has passed certain levels of certification, just like anything. But I think sometimes we also have that notion of like, because you've gotten a certain degree and because you're done with this thing, then all of a sudden it's ending. I think that if we have a culture of like continuous growth, and then if it also can be funded in some way, like it's all nice and cute and fun until we actually start talking about money as well. Because it's expensive to take time
Mhm.
away from doing the regular parts of
Mhm.
your job to actually commit the hours that you're going to need to learning a new thing. And convincing people that that money is worth spending, I think, is another challenge that's going to be ahead of all of us,
That's
especially as
why
the kind of work that you're all doing, really trying to help encourage people who are, at these kind of midpoints of their career to embrace new technological advancements.
Well, books are
so
not expensive. I mean, but I think like
No,
the big one to me was like school taught me to read,
yeah,
but it wasn't until I got into my professional world where I could kind of go out and discover on my own is when I actually learned how to like study and grow within a book, like not just read it. I think there's like
yeah,
two very different, like some people read
Yes.
books and then some people actually like I'm the person that's in there with a highlighter, like, going like it takes me a really long time. But
yeah.
but that's also part of being able to take on something that you actually wanted to take on or something that you like information that you sought out, personally.
Right, because you get the choice, right? It's coming from you. It's not something that happens to you. It's something that you're actively involved in, that you're kind of leading the charge on.
Mhm. Yeah, and then mentorship is huge. Like I mean, anyone who's well, I would say everyone should have a mentor.
Yeah, or
Um,
many.
and then when you
Or
get
many. Yeah.
to, a certain, and I don't know, there's probably not like a prescriptive age to this or a prescription, like a
No.
prescriptive level of expertise, but at some point you should mentor someone too. I just think
And
both of those things
yeah, and I
are
think you have
massive.
to keep on seeking them out too. I mean, one of the things that's been hard, not hard, but like interesting for me recently is that I felt self-conscious coming into the construction world, being that I had so little knowledge, and I also felt, I felt embarrassed about how little I knew. I didn't know any of the acronyms, and people would say things that would just go entirely over my head. And then getting really honest about what I didn't know, and then just telling people I needed help. I think that that requires a different mentality. And
It does.
I want to figure out how we can get people there.
But
Because
So
then
I'm
once
but
the
I
exact
started telling
opposite.
people, like, I don't
Yeah.
understand what you're talking about, then they'll sit down and explain it
Yeah.
to me, and nobody cares. Everyone's
It's funny
happy to
because
do
I'm
it.
the exact opposite as you.
Yeah.
I love being new at something.
Yeah.
Absolutely love it.
right.
Yes.
I
Now I
the
do.
the
Now I think it's
first
really exciting. Yeah.
the first 2 years of something new to me is awesome, and then I'm
Yeah.
like, "Eh,
Right.
all right, I'm over this now. What's next?" So,
Then you teach it. Then you then you get to help the next
but
person get to
I
your
don't even
point.
want anything to do with it at that point. I'm kinda like, "Yeah, I wanna
Sick of
jump
it.
into something new."
Yeah. I mean, don't we need people whose brains work like that? If everybody's
Mm.
did, that would
I
be
hope
great,
so.
right?
Yeah.
Or
But if no one's does, our industry isn't going to get anywhere. Nothing will. We need people who are, constantly moving on to the next thing. And then we need the people like my father in law who are going to do the exact same job for 45 years. You need both.
Right. You need
Right.
both.
And I think that that's the thing is when we talk about like diversity, I'm not talking about it in like, the traditional diversity sense, although that helps too. But I'm talking about like intellectual diversity. Like, and I think that sometimes what we need to do is fight against the whole like, here's what a construction worker looks like kind of a mentality in our culture and understand that like what the actual world of construction looks like is so many different things, right? We're going to need people who are going to be behind a computer screen all day. We're going to need people who are going to be really innovative. We're going to need people who are going to be able to do a somewhat repetitive task extremely well every single time. We're going to need people who care a lot about human relationships. We're going to need people who care a lot about, accountability and like production times. Like you're going to have people in the way that anything works. You're going to have people whose brains just fundamentally work in different ways and people who care about different stuff and collaborating and really working together. And I don't know if I don't think that I had a broad enough view of the diversity of talents and skill sets that were necessary in this industry until until like maybe the past 2 years, as I've really learned a lot more about it and just
Mm.
talked to people in different aspects of it.
You talked about the expense of the education, and I've worked in a shop, and I've worked as an engineer, and now I'm working in software. And one of the biggest problems, like I said, was you're kind of expected to learn on the fly something that is a bit more complex. And with
Right.
technology in particular, a lot of the people that I meet on a job site haven't had familiarity with it throughout their
Yeah.
lives. If I meet somebody, like you said, with the young and the old, the young person's familiar with technology throughout their young life, it's
Right.
not going to be as hard for them to learn on the fly. But
Yes.
taking someone who's older off of a job site where they're being productive and making us a lot of money, like not an insignificant amount of money, like
Right.
lots of money,
Right.
um, each day when they're there and moving that project forward and saying, "Oh no, we're gonna teach you this technology primarily because we want you to help communicate to the next generation," doesn't seem to be happening. And have you talked to anybody about you have your husband, you have your father-in-law, you have whatever the fab shop he was working with was.
Yeah.
Have you talked to them about sort of that difference? Because really, I mean, I've struggled to get 15 minutes of administration time to teach someone how to use, an iPad. And you're not going to teach somebody an iPad in 15 minutes if they're
No.
not familiar with tech.
No. You're just not. And I think that because that's what how do we make a really good case for it, right? Like that this is necessary and that this is long term the better financial decision to make too, right? um
Well,
I think, like, how do we make that case, I'm wondering. Like, have
It's
you
always
guys
really hard.
seen it done successfully? Because every once in a while I see it. I mean, just
I
as an example, just recently, like one of the big fab shops in our area, Sheet Metal Works. Kevin and Sue Ryan are phenomenal humans, and they just bought a laser table, and it requires, I think everybody
a lot
has
of
a
learning.
laser table now, and,
Mm.
it's a learning curve, right? It takes a while to really learn this new system. And I remember them struggling a little bit because, here they are, they've got the shop that's, humming. They're gonna lose money for several months while they're implementing this new system. But what I think they did really well is that they took one of their younger guys and then they took one of their older guys and they sent the two of them away for like 2 weeks, like to get training, like at an in-house place
Mhm.
together.
Yeah.
And then they came back and they felt like, oh, I own this. This is mine.
Right.
And then they
Yeah.
were the ones who taught everybody else. So I
Yeah.
thought like that was, I mean, I don't know how to model that in a larger sense, but I did like
I
the
always loved
approach
there was
that
an
they took.
analogy that described that exact situation that I always loved. And it was like, if you um let's say I decided I wanted to put a pool in my backyard today,
Yeah.
right? Well, what would be the fastest way for me to go put the or dig the hole in the ground right now? Like if I don't know how to use the heavy equipment like a backhoe or a
Right.
digger, the fastest like way for me to do it is with a shovel,
Right.
right?
Right.
So does that mean that's the right way to do, it's kind of one of those the similar analogy where it's like, no, I should probably learn how to use the equipment and do it, Um, but yeah, it's interesting because some people will give up those capital investments because of that, like that short-term ding, because there's a skill lapse in that new.
Yeah.
Um,
I can't remember which sheet metal company it was. It might have been US Engine. I can't remember. They actually had a training budget because you had talked about that. The money
mm,
involved is significant. They were the first people that I ever saw, and we didn't have them at the shop that I was at, that
Yeah.
literally took a bit of each job and said, "This is our training budget." And they
Yeah.
also talked about doing a training assessment before the job with the technologies of these are the technologies we're going to use on the job. Who needs trained? Um, so I've seen at least one
Yeah.
person try it, and they were a much
You have
larger
to
firm.
put me in touch with them. I need to interview them.
Yeah.
Actually,
Oh,
I
we've
can.
got some
I
we've
can
got
put
some
you in
good
touch
names
with that
for you then.
person. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so you do have agency or autonomy in your own fab shop. So have you been able to work with your husband to start to sort of experiment? You seem like an experiment person, and
Yeah.
you describe your husband as an experiment person. So I'm just
Yeah.
going to guess that have you experimented with different ways to train within your own fab shop, just in
It's
sort of
hard.
systematically?
Right? Well, now, in some ways, now we have a really tiny shop. There are only 6 people in our shop, and um, we
Sounds
got
like
to
five
hand select
victims and
them,
one
so
leader.
they're awesome. So I'm biased. I mean, and the, the guys who run our floor, I think, are just really curious and psyched. But what's interesting is that not all of them are good teachers. Um,
Hmm.
like it's so funny. Like we sometimes get like we've got like the R1 new guy who's our apprentice who's learning to use our laser table, and then my our shop foreman who knows how to do everything with enormous detail and has put a ton of his own time in and is like reading about how lasers work and understanding the physics of it in his own spare time and is like that guy is struggling with teaching it because it can be really time consuming and it can
Mhm.
be frustrating when someone's just not getting it or not enjoying the process of it because it's not always fun. I think that's the thing that's hard. And I think that's the thing that was hard for me being a high school teacher. I would have to convince my students of this all the time. I was like, reading this is not always supposed to be fun. This is
Yeah.
this is not always going to be a good time. A lot of time, like learning hurts. It's uncomfortable. um it's in sort of one of like the little weird culture war things that was happening in the high school as I was there was like, well, we can't make students uncomfortable. We're like, learning is uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not actually learning anything. It can be really difficult. It can be frustrating, and you can kind of feel like you're banging your head against the wall. And sometimes you need to almost feel like you're plateauing before you get to that next
Mhm.
point. So I found, I mean, we have a teeny little shop, but I think that what it requires is patience and um and a little bit of grit, not giving up on it just because it's not working at the very beginning of it. So yeah, but with that notion, it is interesting seeing people kind of get past that point where it's frustrating and hard and annoying and time consuming and expensive and nah, I don't want to do this anymore, like that feeling, into actually feeling like, oh, this is my own now. Like now I own this. This is mine. And I've never known anybody ever who's been pissed because they learned something. Like
Right.
nobody's ever like, I'm mad I learned that thing. I mean, people might be like mad I spent that money on that degree, right? That
Mhm.
sometimes happens, or, but I've never known anyone who's angry that they learned a new thing. And so I think that it's perseverance. It's like sticking it out even when it's not going great, or even when it's not fun, or even when it's, causing some friction. It's
And I really wish there was a
committing
way
to
to apply some value to that, because as technologists, I was going to
yeah,
bring up earlier, like we were talking about money and budgets, like as
yeah,
technologists, we're always like, what's the ROI? What's the ROI? And that's
right.
kind of crammed down our throat. It's like ROI, I always, it's always made up. It's always really fuzzy
Yeah,
and whatever. And a lot of the returns are actually that squishy human stuff. Like, yeah, maybe you only do the process 10% better, but people are safer and happier. And so how do you make that case when you're talking to a business, like, yeah, you should have a budget for training because it makes people feel engaged and like they have ownership. Okay, but what does that earn me in the bottom line? And you got to be like, I don't know. Like,
yeah,
happier workers make you more money. There's some research out there that shows it, but you really can't, it's really hard to see on that bottom line.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, you kinda wish, like, if only witchcraft could be a line item on a or,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right.
People want numbers, right? They wanna see, and I don't think we know a lot of times what it or there's such a range on it too,
Right.
um, in that effectiveness.
and the other thing that's hard with education is that it's um so even as a teacher, the only professional development that I was getting when I was a teacher was how to better assess things, how to, be a better grader,
Right.
right? Oh, instead of like it being about like, but it would be frustrating for me because I would have students in my class who already knew everything they needed to know. They could have left before they even got there, right? They didn't even need to be in my class. And then I had students who were really, very far behind and very, very much struggling. And then, you'd have to give some kind of grade to them all at the end. They all had the capability of getting there. They were just going to get there at different times. And I think
Right.
the thing with education that can be really frustrating is that it's not a thing that can be measured and put into, some kind of spreadsheet. You're talking about human beings' capabilities and capacities. It's going to happen when it happens. It's going to take as long as it takes. And it's going to take a lot longer for some people than others, which doesn't mean that it's not worth doing or worth investing in. And making that case can be difficult. But I think it's so necessary, especially right now. I mean, because we can't just, you know, pretend away the fact that everything's going to change.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure, for sure.
I have an ROI for the robots, so you do the
Right.
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
A
Right.
robot makes sense to me. I can put numbers and it does things.
Yeah. Well, Travis, remember during your it was the technology panel, which was standing room only at SmackNet. It was like the super popular. But you asked at one point, like, how many of you think that foundationally this is a industry about human relationships? And like every hand went up in the
Everybody.
room,
Yeah.
right? And I think that that's something that we need to stay focused on, even as we're switching into a more and more automated world, even as we're entering into, AI and robotics and all the things that are coming for our traditional ways of thinking about and conceptualizing work. It's human relationships,
Right.
having just informal, real conversations with people. And there's no one system of education that's going to work for all of us. I guarantee all four of us learn in very different ways, right? Just like what actually makes us learn, the pace at which we will, the different strengths we're going to have, the types of questions that we're going to raise, the way our brains work are going to be different. Doesn't mean that all of us don't have the ability and capacity to kind of get to that same point that we need to get to. It's just going to develop at different ways and at different paces.
Hmm.
So it's, extremely difficult even within a school setting that is entirely foundationally based around how do we assess what is learned, right? And how do we measure it? And how do we, put some kind of score and some kind of number behind it? Even there, it fails us. So actually trying to like put the hard number behind that is difficult. It's more of like a way of approaching things. It's like a
Well,
shifting
that
in
yeah,
what we
I was
care
gonna say
about and why.
w-
Yeah.
it's something we've heard. I think Trent, you say this a lot. We all talk about it a lot. Tell me how I'm measured, and I'll tell you how I perform. Right? If you are constantly measured on how to assess people, that's all you're going to focus on in your.
Right.
Yeah, that one kills me, man. I always
Yeah.
hate it when people say that because I'm like, that's so reflective and just so uncreative. Um,
Yeah.
the so we talk a lot about as technology has come into the industry and fabrication has taken on
Yeah.
more of a role, manufacturing has taken on more of a role. Um, our education is still primarily apprenticeship out in the field. So
Yeah.
as we lose the ability to, we I think that the overall concern comes down to sort of a brain drain as we start
Yeah.
to automate. Are we going to have the education to give them the basic skills like Trent, you were talking about the T square and learning how to draft. I was a draftsman and a modeler. I learned on Mylar. And when I was teaching other people, what really annoyed me is they didn't understand geometric construction. And I was like, wait, you have a basic fundamental skill that you don't understand. It's going to keep biting you in the butt. So, what do you, as an educator, are there things that you think we should be doing as an industry to look at that brain drain in a constructive way and say, okay, here we're going to have to actually add some supplemental in education because we're not going to have them do this job anymore because we
Yeah.
bought a laser table and they
Right.
don't need to learn how to do all these other things because we got a laser table. So have you seen a lot of that? Have you thought about that as you're thinking about how to bring education forward?
Well,
That
I will
brain.
now. That's an excellent question. I need to think more about that. No, it's so interesting, right? Because where, right, where are those lines where the information? Like, I'm thinking about Trent talking about laying things out with the T square, right? Like,
Yeah.
and how that could be really frustrating. But at the same point in time, you do need to foundationally understand like the basic components of something and what something actually is rather than just understanding the process because then the process
Hmm.
changes if you don't understand like the real basic fundamentals of it, then
Right.
it can be
Yeah.
really, I don't know.
Devin, I had
I mean, if somebody's laying something out, I want them to be able to understand basic geometry, Um, that's complicated. Also, that comes in at so many different points, right? It's not as if you have one set of fundamentals and that's all you ever need, right? You're going to need different fundamentals for different types of roles that you're doing as your career changes and um as whatever it is that you're working on develops. Also, fundamentals, if you're thinking about that kind of stuff and like the brain drain aspect of it. There, it's gonna like I think you're gonna all of a sudden I'm gonna be 45 and I'm gonna need to learn certain fundamentals,
oh
like
yeah.
in order
Yeah.
to do all of that. So again, I think it comes back down to maybe just that idea of patience and like the grit that not needing to see it work perfectly by the end of the week. That idea that some of this is just going to take time. And I think that we can have growth happen fast or we can have it happen ethically. And I kind of hope we choose to do things more ethically, that rather than just worrying about speed, we're also thinking about long-term sustainability and real human relationships. Yeah.
Absolutely. I I um I think it's funny. I want to bring this up. I had a foreman named Brian Hirschman when I was learning layout. So I was a draftsman, and I
Yeah.
had to learn from the guys in the field that didn't know drafting because I could draft faster, so they don't want to draw. Um, but
Right.
we had a guy named Brian Hirschman. He looked at all of the work I did over a week, and he said, man, I can do this with a plumb bob and like a horn. I can lay this all out, and it'd be done in 15 minutes. And I joked with him about it, and then I went out to see what he did, and it
Yeah.
was probably the most fascinating time I ever had. Do you
Yeah.
do you see, we're gonna lose those people really fast. They're gonna retire
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
So right now, Is there anything you're looking at telling businesses to do that really helps them hold on to the knowledge that was part of their sort of tribal knowledge that's in sheet metal? Because
Yeah.
I've seen a ton of books. I've never seen a
Tribal
book that's
knowledge
going
is
to
such a
show me
good
how
way to
to
put it.
lay that
Yeah.
stuff out.
Yeah.
It's totally different than what I
No, you're
learned
not
in a
going to
book.
learn that in any book.
No. Yeah.
No. Well, I mean, but that's the whole thing, right? I think that the learning, whatever it is you can learn from a book or even, a lecture or a YouTube video or an anything is very different than what you can learn by sitting there with somebody who's mastered their craft. And I think that brings us back into like the mentorship
Yeah,
role, right? Like I
Yeah.
think that that also brings us back into maybe you know, treating that work with dignity and then also paying people for the hours they're spending doing that work.
yeah. The paying people thing tends to be something we
That's
just
kind
leave out.
I
of that's
know.
It's
right.
an extra. It's an extra. You're learning and becoming a better person. We're feeding your curiosity. You don't actually need money. It's fine. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
needs to be
No.
some sort of incentive there,
There
Yeah.
does.
other than yeah.
I mean, people will always do more for love than they will for money, right?
Yes, correct.
Um, and I think that if people are, given that real incentive of like genuine appreciation, and I think that that accounts for something. But I think that we can't pretend that it doesn't take time and resources because it does, right? Like, and I think that trying to, um, yeah, trying to reframe things where you're going to have to spend time and resources on educating yourself or like being educated through hopefully the workplace, right? But also in lots of places. Doesn't stop when you're 18 or 23 or wherever it is that your formal education stops, right? Like we need to have more places where people are taking real time and spending real resources on the process of education throughout the entire career. Like it never stops. You're never going to stop spending money and time that is purely and singularly for the purpose of educating yourself.
Yeah. And it
Now
can't
that
be
you're in
forced.
the
If it's forced, the whole thing kind of fails, in my
right.
opinion.
Because you're not the agent of it. It's not coming from you. I mean, I can be thrown into any class and it's because my boss made me go and I'm going to
Right.
sit there and, play on my phone.
Well, that's when
But
you read, you
yeah,
don't study, right? It's different.
yes, right.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
Or you don't even
I,
read, you pretend to read.
Well,
Put it in
I
ChatGPT
would
and
argue
says,
just
yeah,
reading really isn't
yeah,
anything in and of
yeah.
itself anyways. It's not,
yeah.
I mean,
But it's
y-
wasted time unless you get that buy-in first.
mhm.
right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I know you didn't have a big business background before you came into construction, but
Yeah, like
do you
none.
think that part of the issue that we have, this is something that because I come from outside of construction too, so part of I don't know if call it an issue, but it's just the job cost mindset. Everything has
Yeah,
to go to a job so I can get paid for it. That's why you hear constant battles over overhead and everything like that. And I do think that that kind of maybe hinders some of what we do with training and everything like that because we feel like we have to stuff it into a job somewhere.
yeah,
Is that what you're seeing some of too? It's like it's really
yeah,
hard to justify sending these two guys to wherever to learn this table because I don't have a job to put it on. But if you really step back and think about it, they're they're affecting all jobs. So how do you
yes.
really, you know, how do you relate that?
I mean, for a really small place like mine, it just has to become part of the overhead, right? Like
Sure.
we spend money on insurance and, our rent and our paying back our loans and our bookkeeper every month, like
Right.
we have to spend money on accounting. Like, you have your budgets for things. If you can just work professional development into your budget. I mean, professional development sounds like one of those terms. It's kind of sucks. I mean, anybody who's given mandatory professional development hates mandatory professional development. But if it's something
Yes.
that's there and exists, but it's actually like part of the team meetings consistently, it's like, wait, what other resources do you need? What can we send you to? Like, what do you need time and money to do?
Yeah.
And then it's
Yeah.
coming from the individuals instead of it coming from the top down.
I'll tell you a trick that kind of worked for me, Travis. I think this is was like, because
Yeah.
what you're saying is, let's say there's a crew that has a job. There's a foreman who's in charge of this job, maybe him and his project manager, and they're like, hey, I need three, additional personnel to come help me do this job. And it's like, well, you're gonna get this A level journeyman, and then you're gonna get two C level apprentices, right? And he's gonna say, screw that. I don't have the hours in the job. I need 3 A-level journeymen to come do this so we can beat the hours and knock it out of the park. And
Right.
he's not wrong in his thinking,
Right.
complete like if you're just trying to please the numbers or please the books. But I don't know if you're like me and you try to gamify everything and everything's a competition in my mind. So
Yeah.
the way I took that further was like, okay, well, anyone can knock it out of the park with an A team. That doesn't make you a
Right.
good leader. So now you're like, so then the challenge became like, well, how about I beat the number with a C team? And then what does that mean
Right.
about me? Right. So there's a way to gamify it somewhat because, and I'm not demonizing the C player. The apprentice is a C player just
Yeah.
because that's what they are. And
Right.
a good apprentice probably is a C player.
Yeah.
That's probably a pretty good apprentice. So yeah, I mean, so a way to like, challenge that leader to be like, look, we know you can kick that project's ass if I give you the best guys in the company, right?
Yeah.
But the reason
But
you're the
anybody
best
can.
leader is
Yeah.
because you can take any team there is and
I
beat
can
them.
kick its ass.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Right. That
Yeah.
also makes it more fun.
Yeah.
It should
Right.
make it more fun if you're
Yeah.
really like
Challenge it.
competitive. Yeah.
Yeah.
We are getting towards the top of the hour, and I did have one question. Since you are an English literature person and you are talking about self-education, and most of our listeners, I'm just flat out telling you, read way too many books. So do you have any books? Like as you
We
were
study
talking, I'm
them, we
like,
don't read them.
yes, we don't.
Yes.
We study them. We study them. Trent,
There you
Yes.
go.
Trent is exactly right. But as you were talking, I'm like, oh, I wonder if she read Extreme Ownership or Drive by David
I
Pink
read
or any
Drive
of
By.
those.
I have not read Extreme Ownership, although it's a
That's Jocko's, but you talk about it. All of the
yeah.
ideas have some like some leaders over into it. Are there any books that you can think that you might want to throw out to our audience about education? Because one of the things that I really struggle with is actually that mentoring piece. I
Yeah.
do good with the cultural part, but I talk too fast and over people's head often. And I would not describe myself as a good teacher. So, like, what are some books that we might, because we all need to be better mentors, we might look at for better mentorship, or that you found really inspirational, that you might want to throw out there as we kind of close out?
Oh, yes. There's lots. I mean, actually, it's interesting. Sometimes, like books on teaching or books on education might not be the most compelling and interesting ones to read. But books that are written by people who are really interested in education that are more specifically about the thing you want to learn.
Yeah.
So, like a writer who I love. Do you guys read any of Scott Galloway's stuff? He
Can
wrote
you?
the Four Horsemen. He's the guy who he writes a
The
lot
Four
about like
Horsemen. That one sounds right.
yeah.
Sounds familiar.
So I love everything that Scott Galloway writes because foundationally, what he is, he's an educator, right? Like what he is that he's a professor, and everything that he's writing comes from the foundational belief that curiosity is core to success, really, in absolutely anything. So I like that philosophical approach. So really, anything that's written by Scott Galloway, regardless of what
Cool.
aspect of any trade anybody's in, I think is really good. The other thing, and this is an unconventional suggestion, I think people should read fiction and literature. I think that
Yeah.
even if you're in a totally different field, I think that every once in a while, reading something that's hard and interesting and weird is really good for your brain. And I
Yeah.
think that reading things that don't necessarily have to do with the field that you're in, because we're all going to do that anyway, right? Like
Right.
we're going to pick up the book and Google the thing and listen to the podcast and watch the video and YouTube videos and all the stuff on the thing that it is that we need to learn. So, like, right now for my company, I need to learn more about like welded components of data center fabrication. I'm going to Google that and read the stuff that's on that topic.
That's a
But I
real eye
also,
opener.
Yes.
have Julius Caesar on my desk right now that I'm
Right
going to
on.
reread for the fourth time because it's good for my brain. And I think that I regret nothing about getting my PhD in English literature. Sometimes I felt like I was dancing on the head of a pin, and it's not necessarily directly related to the work that I'm doing now as the owner of a welding shop, but it also isn't not. I think that anything that you're reading that makes your brain hurt a little bit in a good way, that's going to open up new neural pathways, that's going to keep that neuroplasticity going, that's going to keep you, trying to draw new connections. But I think reading fiction and poetry and things that are beautiful and compelling and strange and weird and make you think about language and thought patterns in different ways and spending time in someone else's mind, I think all of that is really, really good for the brain, no matter what you do. So yeah, whatever it is, go to the library. If you've
Oh,
got
right
two
on.
brain cells to read together and a free library card, you're like unstoppable. You can do anything. Sit around and just like breeze through stuff that's entirely outside of your regular wheelhouse. And I think that can sometimes fire up stuff that you don't see coming.
And nerds out there, there's a app called Libby that will allow you to connect to your library and you can get all the
Yes.
books you want in audio or in almost any
Audiobooks, listen to them
format.
on your
Yeah.
commute, listen to them when you're doing the boring thing that you have to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I have to say I've had a lot of fun. I have read The Four by Scott Galloway. I had to look it up while you were talking about it because
Yeah.
it sounded very
I say with
familiar.
the four horsemen, it's not the four, right? Or whatever it
Yeah,
is.
no,
Yeah.
it's actually really it is a fantastic book, and I really
Yeah.
recommend it.
Well, he's a
I'll
teacher,
tell
right?
you,
Like what
yeah,
he is at the end of the day. Yeah.
yeah. I have found myself recently in a series. I For whatever reason I like historical fiction, so I like reading about like actual people that did historical things, but this
Yeah.
totally made up story about some. So the Flashman series, I think it was written back in the '60s.
Oh, I haven't heard of
Um,
those. I'm gonna look it up now.
he's like a I think he's a British soldier that kind of gets inserted in all this stuff during the British colonial days from like the 1820s to the 1870s or something like
Oh,
that.
that's
So
cool.
like he rides with Custer, he fights in India, like it's crazy, but it's a lot of fun. So
Oh, that's fun. Ooh, this looks fun.
um, but so as we kind of can fade out, what can the construction dorks and the construction dork community do to help you in your task um, to give you more information to build a path for because you to your point that you brought up several times, we are going to need people, and we're going to need to educate people on what's great about this industry, why they should be here, and to prepare them. What can we offer back to you to help you along your journey
Well,
here?
keep doing what you're doing because your podcast is so fun. And like, whenever you get to be nerdy about something and because you guys actually care and you think it's interesting and exciting, if we can have it more modeled, like why this is interesting and exciting and why lots of different people and bring people like me who are maybe not like the most traditional, construction people on, but you do that all the time. You always are bringing in people who are a little bit outside of the traditional fields. Keep doing that and keep fostering conversations that are going through multiple disciplines, everybody getting out of their silos, I think is really good. Talking, more across all these different, people who you might not think have something to
Yeah.
contribute very often will. You're already doing that. And then I'm going to be bugging everybody and interviewing you about your own educational paths and how you got to where you were, because it sounds like everybody has different paths. You and Trent both came from a military background, which I'm sure gave you so many ways of thinking about the world and shaping your worldview and giving you, new making your brain hurt in ways that are useful and good and challenging you, which is amazing. And if we can have more understanding about how broad the construction industry actually is and how many different types of people with different kinds of priorities and ways of viewing the world and different skill sets can thrive, the stronger it can be. So I think a lot of good work is already being done, but I think that more reaching across and explaining to more and more people who you might not think care why they should is exciting.
Cool.
And then also the mentorship, right? I think, and I also
Yeah.
think really cool stuff is happening. Like right now, the heavy metal summer experience is a
Oh,
cool
heavy
thing
metal's
that Snap
awesome.
is doing. We had a bunch of the heavy metal summer camp kids come in and like learn how to weld in our shop. And we had like, I think we had like 17 or 18 like high school
Wow.
kids doing that, and it was so cool. And two of those kids are joining are joining the union next year, which is so cool.
Fantastic.
And like that kind of stuff. I mean, as small as it is, it's growing, and
Oh, it's growing
more and more
rapidly.
Oh,
of
it's
those things are
growing
It
happening.
is. Yeah.
insanely. It's
Yeah,
the most addictive program I've
If
ever
that was a
seen, man.
publicly
it's
traded company
so
on Wall
fun.
Street, people would be, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Uh,
so fun. I loved it. That was like so funny. I had like a little bit of a hard time because they were coming in like our busiest week of the summer, and everyone was like a little cranky about like having like a whole day where we weren't going to be in production. And at the end of it, everybody was like, "That was the best thing ever."
Right.
We're going to do this every year.
Devin, that's what completely shocked me. We were talking about like not bringing in your foreman for a day, but yet we'll adapt our fab shop to teach kids. I think that was really positive for the culture, and the fact that it's
Yeah,
catching
Yes.
on so well and has such excellent leadership and sort of
it's
just a
so
great
great.
vision behind it. Um,
And people care and they're putting real money behind it, right?
They
Like in those
really
cases,
yes,
love it.
even with
significant money.
toolboxes
That's
and
significant
boots.
money.
And,
Yeah.
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 And but it's so worth. Have you talked to anybody who's been involved in heavy metal and hasn't loved it?
Yeah.
Like everyone's loved
Yeah.
it.
No,
So,
everybody
no.
loved
Well,
it.
Right.
Yeah,
you're not even talking about being in that if you don't love the idea. So, I mean,
yeah,
yeah, everyone who's a part of it loves it because yeah, you wouldn't even raise your hand if it didn't excite you, you know.
yeah,
So,
For
um,
sure.
and these
yeah.
contractors
And
aren't
it's
being held to
hard to be
gunpoint.
around that kind of energy and not get psyched about it, you know. And I
Exactly.
think that showcasing that more, the more joy we can show, right? The more that we can show, like, this is fun, this is exciting and cool. And also this isn't this old fashioned, like, 19th century trade. This is something that's innovative and cool and growing and
Yep.
changing and like, I don't know. I think it's because I work for Google. That's like my regular how I make money on the side job. It's way
Yeah.
more fun working in my weird welding shop than it is working for Google. you know?
Uh,
It's more
um,
real. Yeah.
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 Well, we are coming up on, yeah, we're a little over an hour. So I think Angie and heavy metal are a great place to leave this. And if you want to learn more about that, we do have an episode where we had her on and she talked about the Heavy Metal Academy. I know we've talked about it in the past, so kind of look back there. But thank you for listening. And Devin, thank you so much for coming on and
This was so
sharing
much
all of your
fun. I
wonderful
love this
ideas.
conversation. I hope
It
we
was
can stay in touch and I can ask you more
We will
questions.
absolutely stay in touch and we will get
Yeah.
you in touch with some fab shops that have the education. And this has been wonderful. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. This has been episode 91